Picture a machine stripped to its bones, roaring across an open highway with nothing but wind resistance and attitude shaping its profile. A silhouette stretched long and low, chrome catching light like a moving sculpture. Imagine the kind of ride that doesn't blend into traffic but cuts through it with a stance so deliberate it borders on defiance, built not for conformity but for expression. These weren't factory visions, and they didn't roll out of assembly lines with glossy brochures and warranty cards. They were born from hands that valued character over convention, turning metal into statements and engines into identity. In an era when rebellion wasn't just a mood but a movement, the road became a canvas and the motorcycle became the message. Loud, imperfect, and unforgettable. Beneath the custom paint, beneath the raked forks and sky-high handlebars, there was a deeper story about pride, freedom, and the urge to build something nobody else had. If that kind of iron and imagination speaks to you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the next machine you want to dive into. Shovelhead choppers emerged in the 1970s as a reaction to both tradition and limitation. And the Shovelhead chopper's name itself carries all the cultural weight of that shift. Even before you get to the nuts and bolts of what people were doing with the engines and frames, the mindset behind modifying these bikes tells the real beginning of the story. Riders who bought stock, Harleys with Shovelhead motors quickly realized that the machines coming out of the factory were designed for broad consumer expectations and not the personal identity many owners wanted to project. The Shovelhead was reliable enough for its time, offered more power than the earlier Panhead, and put down the kind of torque that felt substantial on the road. But the styling and structure felt bulky, conservative, and mass-produced to a generation that was changing faster than corporate design departments could track. By the time the counterculture wave settled into the mainstream, the idea of simply riding what everyone else had was unappealing, and that's where the first round of modifications began. Not as a polished industry, but as a necessity for riders who wanted something leaner, louder, and unmistakably their own. Stripping weight was often the first move. Removing fenders, ditching side covers, pulling off any chrome that didn't serve a structural purpose, because Shovelhead owners knew the engine was the centerpiece, and everything around it could be shaped to frame that presence rather than hide it behind factory extras. The frame itself became canvas and challenge. And the decision to cut, stretch, or rake one wasn't made lightly, especially when many of the early builders lacked formal training and were working with torches and basic welding tools in garages behind houses or small shared commercial spaces. Even those first crude choppers hinted at a new identity. Narrow front wheels, high handlebars, long forks, and seating positions that forced the rider into a posture that communicated intent even before the engine turned over. One of the major motivations was cost. Shovelhead motors were accessible compared to more exotic mechanical platforms, and as older models showed up on the used market, customizers could grab a base unit without emptying their bank accounts. Returning veterans brought a mechanical confidence mixed with restlessness, and many of them saw the process of rebuilding and reshaping these bikes as both therapy and personal branding. Where Harley-Davidson saw models and sales figures, the custom builders saw outlines and potential. And that difference shaped not just the look of the finished bikes, but the culture around them. Owners who didn't have the skills to fabricate parts on their own leaned on small independent shops that were popping up across cities and rural areas. Places where someone was always willing to try welding a new neck angle or narrowing a tank even if no official guidelines existed for safety or structural integrity. Because these builds were evolving outside official channels, trial and error produced both breakthroughs and disasters, and word of what worked traveled person to person, ride to ride, show to show. The Shovelhead engine itself was often left largely intact, not because builders lacked imagination, but because it delivered the kind of low-end grunt and signature sound no one wanted to dilute. Instead, they framed the power plant like art, choosing tanks that hugged its shape, pipes that drew the eye, and frames that made the motor appear almost suspended in space. Custom paint complemented rather than concealed with flames, metal flake, or scallops, helping the Shovelhead become instantly recognizable before the starter kicked in. There was also a shift in ownership mentality. Rather than thinking of a motorcycle as a consumer product maintained through dealerships, many saw it as something they shaped season to season as their tastes evolved or as trends shifted in different parts of the country. It wasn't uncommon for a bike to change handlebars 3 times in a year or swap out seats depending on the miles an owner expected to cover. That fluid sense of design was encouraged by the fact that back then, Regulations were looser, and inspections were often local and inconsistent. So a rider could push the envelope without worrying about standardized enforcement, especially in states with strong motorcycle subcultures. The pride of ownership wasn't about getting something brand new. It was about telling a story with what you built, what you rode, and how far from stock you could go without sacrificing the core identity of the machine. When you look at the early 1970s scene, the Shovelhead choppers weren't just a side chapter in motorcycle history. They were the beginning of a full-on rethinking of what ownership meant, how individuality could trump pedigree, and why design could become protest without words. All of that energy and experimentation created both admiration and backlash, and the response outside the garages and small gatherings took shape in surprising ways, which is where the story takes a sharp turn next. Shovelhead choppers entered the broader American conversation once the visual and cultural impact became too bold to ignore, and the Shovelhead chopper's name itself was suddenly shorthand for everything rebellious, impractical, and mesmerizing about custom motorcycle culture as it clashed with the mainstream. As these bikes started showing up at rallies, swap meets, and roadside hangouts, what had once been a scattered network of garage creations began coalescing into a movement defined by shared aesthetics and rival interpretations. Riders who had never met could recognize a stretched frame, a radically narrowed tank, or a raked front end, and know instantly that the builder was chasing the same ethos, even if the execution differed wildly based on skill, budget, or local influence. That growing visibility triggered several responses. Curiosity from new riders who wanted in, disdain from traditionalists who saw their beloved brand being mutilated, and concern from regulators who weren't prepared for machines that no longer resembled the vehicles listed on registration papers. The aftermarket industry saw opportunity faster than the factory did, and by the mid-1970s, independent companies were producing extended fork tubes, custom seats, sissy bars, unique tanks, and even entire frame kits designed specifically to handle Shovelhead engines. That new layer of production both legitimized and accelerated the style, especially for owners who lacked the tools or fabrication expertise to build from scratch. Magazines dedicated to custom motorcycles spread images and instructions, and suddenly the once isolated builders had templates and inspiration arriving in their mailboxes. Rivalries formed between regions over how extreme a build could get without losing the ability to ride long distances, and the debate over form versus function became as heated as any argument over horsepower or brand loyalty. Some builders focused on elegance and proportion, turning out bikes with clean lines and balanced stance, while others pursued radical geometry that sacrificed comfort for spectacle, resulting in machines that looked incredible parked but demanded acrobatics to maneuver at low speed. Even so, the Shovelhead engine remained the anchor, solid, loud, and instantly recognizable, and every customization decision orbited around how to showcase it. Law enforcement, insurance companies, and safety advocates struggled with these machines because no two were alike. Frame alterations complicated registration, lighting changes affected compliance, and stripped-down wiring made inspections unpredictable. Still, most riders argued that personal accountability and mechanical understanding mattered more than conforming to standards written with automobiles in mind. The cultural debate wasn't just about looks. It was about who had the right to define what a motorcycle should be. Rival manufacturers watched these builds and saw an opening to attract younger buyers, but without the Shovelhead motor's cultural capital, their attempts to replicate the style often missed the mark. In response, Harley-Davidson itself faced a crossroads: ignore the trend and risk becoming irrelevant to a new generation, or adapt and incorporate the design language that was emerging from garages rather than boardrooms. Meanwhile, motorcycle clubs and independent riders were shaping a social ecosystem around these bikes, where long-haul runs, roadside repairs, and garage nights built loyalty and identity. Television and movies occasionally used Shovelhead choppers as visual shorthand for anti-establishment characters, further cementing the association between style and attitude. Even people who had never ridden a motorcycle could tell that these machines weren't factory-born, and that mystique kept interest high even among non-riders. By the time the movement peaked in visibility, the Shovelhead chopper was no longer a fringe experiment. It was a symbol of creative defiance that forced both industry and culture to respond. That impact carried consequences far beyond aesthetics, and the legacy of those decisions reshaped not just what bikes looked like, but how future generations would approach ownership and customization, which sets the stage for how their influence endures today. Shovelhead choppers carved their place in history, not just through visuals and noise, but through the lasting influence their builders unintentionally created. And the Shovelhead chopper's name continues to carry meaning because enthusiasts today still draw from that same well of creativity and defiance. As the custom scene matured in the late 1970s and 1980s, many of the radical builds either evolved into more rideable configurations or ended up preserved as snapshots of a moment when experimentation outran regulation, budget, and predictability. Harley-Davidson eventually acknowledged the cultural impact by releasing models with factory styling cues borrowed from the chopper look. Longer forks, stepped seats, and trimmed bodywork, but they couldn't replicate the handmade asymmetry that gave the originals their soul. That tension between corporate interpretation and grassroots authenticity shaped how future customizers approached their projects, spawning an entire aftermarket economy that still thrives on frames, tanks, and parts designed to fit Shovelhead motors. Owners who held on to their original builds found themselves part of a living archive, where each weld, paint job, and component swap told a story of an era when individuality outranked conformity. The aftermarket world also resurrected interest in engine rebuilding, because keeping a Shovelhead running required knowledge that modern plug-and-play bikes didn't demand. Enthusiasts today often seek out these motors not just for nostalgia, but for the mechanical honesty they represent, a willingness to wrench, adjust, and learn rather than outsource everything to technicians with diagnostic computers. Shows and events dedicated to vintage customs routinely feature Shovelhead choppers, and younger builders study their proportions and quirks the way architects study blueprints of iconic structures. Some of the original icons of the movement became mentors, preserving unwritten rules about stance, proportion, and attitude, while new builders reinterpret those elements through modern tools without losing the spirit of improvisation. Market value tells its own story. Bikes once built on shoestring budgets and scrapyard finds are now bought, sold, and auctioned as functional art, while period-correct parts fetch high prices among restorers and collectors trying to recreate authentic builds from the 1970s. Preservation also raises questions about what should remain untouched and what should be updated for safety or reliability, especially as some frames and engines have weathered half a century of use, neglect, or reconfiguration. With vintage motorcycle registration and import laws continuing to evolve, American enthusiasts weigh originality against practicality, deciding whether to modernize brakes and lighting or retain every era-specific imperfection. For some, the magic lies in the imperfections, the slight wobble in long forks at speed, the kickstart ritual, or the way a handmade sissy bar flexes under load. Those traits remind owners that someone sweated over metal rather than ordering a complete kit. Many riders view maintaining and preserving these customs as a responsibility, not just a hobby, because the bikes represent a time when creativity wasn't filtered through online tutorials or corporate design committees. Yet the legacy isn't only about preservation, it's also about evolution. Builders who admire the Shovelhead chopper style often integrate hidden upgrades like stronger frames, electronic ignitions, or disc brake conversions to make the bikes roadworthy without losing their visual DNA. The modern custom scene, whether you look at garage builders, boutique shops, or televised competitions, still traces its roots to the rebellious spirit that Shovelhead choppers embodied. Even riders who don't build full customs adopt elements like ape hangers, narrow tanks, or tall sissy bars as visual nods to the movement. The influence reaches beyond motorcycles into fashion, art, photography, and American mythology, proving that the designs weren't merely mechanical choices, but cultural statements. As long as riders care about making their machines personal rather than generic, the lineage continues to evolve. And while not every bike on the road today wears a raw metal tank or raked fork, the idea that a motorcycle can be a reflection of self rather than a prepackaged product owes its persistence to the Shovelhead era. The future of these customs hinges on preservation, education, and a continued appetite for individuality, all of which remain strong enough to keep the story alive as new generations pick up old tools and learn new tricks. Shovelhead choppers still attract riders and collectors in the United States because they combine mechanical character, historical significance, and visual presence in a way modern factory bikes rarely match. And the Shovelhead chopper's legacy continues to influence how people evaluate ownership, restoration, and value today. Someone considering one of these machines has to start with availability, since complete period builds are no longer common on the open market. Estate sales, regional auctions, and word-of-mouth deals through veteran builder networks are more reliable sources than mainstream listings. Pricing varies wildly based on originality, build quality, and whether the bike is a preserved survivor or a modern recreation using vintage parts. A period-correct custom with a documented history can command a premium, especially if it still carries hand-fabricated parts from a known builder, while unfinished projects or bikes with mismatched components can be more affordable entry points for those willing to wrench. Buyers also need to understand that maintenance isn't passive. Keeping a Shovelhead tuned and leak-free requires familiarity with carburetors, timing adjustments, and sourcing gaskets or components from specialty suppliers who cater to older Harley platforms. Unlike modern motorcycles that rely heavily on electronics and dealer diagnostics, these bikes reward owners who enjoy hands-on involvement and accept the occasional oil drip as part of the experience. Insurance and registration vary by state, especially when frames have been modified or titles trace back to donor bikes rather than original factory frames. Some riders solve this with assembled title programs, while others stick to bikes that were never heavily altered in the paperwork. Parts availability is strong thanks to reproduction suppliers and a dedicated aftermarket, though some builders prefer swapping or salvaging era-correct components to maintain authenticity. Riding a Shovelhead chopper is not the same as riding a contemporary cruiser. Kickstarting rituals, rigid frames, long forks, and high handlebars demand both patience and skill, especially on uneven pavement or long-distance trips. Enthusiasts who embrace that reality often describe it as the cost of owning something with personality instead of sterility. From a reliability standpoint, the engines can run dependably if maintained correctly, and many have been updated with electronic ignition or improved charging systems without altering their identity. The bigger challenge comes from wiring, brakes, and structural integrity on older custom frames, making pre-purchase inspections critical. Collectors and historians see these bikes as rolling art and cultural documents that reflect an era when riders weren't waiting for permission to create. And that perception drives both interest and preservation efforts. For younger riders entering the custom world, Shovelhead choppers offer lessons in proportion, restraint, and storytelling, the idea that every weld and part choice should support a vision rather than copy a trend. The lasting influence can also be seen in today's factory customs and aftermarket catalogs, which continue to imitate the stance, lines, and attitude of bikes built in garages 50 years ago. Even riders who never planned to own one feel the impact every time they walk into a dealership and see stripped-down models that owe their existence to handmade inspiration. In the end, these machines endure because they refuse to be generic, and that quality appeals to anyone who believes character should outweigh conformity. The final takeaway is simple. If you want a motorcycle that tells a story before you touch the throttle, nothing replaces a Shovelhead chopper.